Hey, we're live. Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to discuss some new APIs that will probably supplant CanComponent and CanDefine in CanJS 6. These new APIs will actually be available in CanJS 5, but our hope is that we can make them the new core APIs for CanJS 6. So started releasing these in CanJS 5.5, but they're under ecosystem, so there's still a lot of possibility of making changes. We're going to be developing a project with these tools very shortly. So they're about to be more difficult, not impossible to change going forward, but more strenuous and difficult to change. So this is the last best time to weigh in and say, no, this is super confusing. We hate this, before things get, if not written in stone, written in like pen that still has the eraser but doesn't erase super well. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who is now leading the development of CanJS, to describe these new APIs, walk through it, hopefully get everybody excited here. Also, probably repeat some of the sales pitch at some point. But really what we want to do is, I would say, make sure everybody understands what these APIs are and what they mean first and foremost.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So to reiterate, so all of these APIs that I'm going to talk about now are actually available now in CanJS, in CanJS 5, whatever it was, 27 that we released yesterday. So you can start using these. They might break. I wouldn't production app right now unless you're really flexible. And another thing that I'm not sure Justin mentioned, these probably will take over the same kind of roles that CanComponent and CanDefine fill now, but we're not going to get rid of those APIs. Don't be worried that we're going to remove CanComponent or stop supporting CanDefine or anything like that. These are just kind of newer APIs that we want people to use if they can. Cool. With that, I'm going to share my screen and start walking through a bunch of examples. So there's basically 4 new APIs. The primary one, there's StacheDefineElement and DefineObject. There's also DefineArray, and there's a new project called CanType that has some of the new type stuff that we'll show later on. This is a basic example. Can everybody see this okay? Just going to assume you can. Cool. So this goes through a basic example. This shows you how you would make a to-do sort of your model with these new APIs. One of the biggest things is these are built around using class, JavaScript or ECMAScript classes. So you can do class to-do extends our DefineObject, and then the same thing for the custom element class. So you'll create this edit to-do class that extends StacheDefineElement, which is our base class. So these let you do a lot of things, but this is a basic example of what this will look like. You can create a type. You can use that like you would use an extended define map today, and then StacheDefineElement supports a static view property and this static define property for creating your stash view and your state management with DefineObject. And then you can use that class that's created to create a custom element. So you can call custom elements define. This is the name of the tag that you want to use, and then this is your the class that we built up here. Cool. Any questions about this basic example before we move on to some of the details? Feel free to talk. Anybody else that's on here. Definitely want to get feedback now as we go through. Nothing?
I'll make one point that it's probably useful for people to understand some of the design constraints. Originally we were thinking of heavily using decorators for a lot of the property definitions. Right as we were about to really set about designing this, the 3rd version of decorators was announced. And we felt that decorators were too topsy-turvy or too unreliable to focus on, to use as what the API for what the API should depend on. So we focused on a syntax that was supported by at least fun browser. Static defines are like, as we're showing here, static define initializers are supported, I think, only currently in Chrome, but there's a getter shorthand. Static getters are supported everywhere in every major browser, so you could always just change it to what Kevin is doing to get it to just work directly in the browser. We really felt like we wanted something that people could just use in a browser without having to set up some transpiler to make it work. So that was one of the design considerations. And the other one was we wanted to use class, which we've done. And the final one was we wanted to make custom elements work.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So this is all supported in Chrome. Like that one thing that I have this console open here, so we can just go through and try these things. So all of that stuff ran natively in Chrome. There's no transpilation, there's no Babel or anything going on here. And then with that, you can create your edit to do element, and that gives you back the actual element.
Kevin, you might want to raise your console's bottom line up, because I don't think people will, because the row of people's faces is covering it. You might want to go even over there. That's high enough. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So you can do that, and then here, let me just move some stuff. Here, I can move this. So we do that, and then you can see that our edit to do element is in there. We can mess with this. We'll see all this stuff later. To do an object. Oh, yeah, that shouldn't work. Okay, cool. But let's move on. But yeah, the point is that all of this will work natively in Chrome. If you want to support other browsers, you can't use these public fields like this. You'll have to use the static getters, like Justin mentioned. But then if you do that, then your code will be supported natively in Edge and above. So everything not IE.
Hey, Kevin, this is Adam, longtime listener, first-time caller. I am just wondering about the word define, and I realize that we have a usage for it in CanJS, but I'm wondering, since you're kind of breaking new ground here, making new objects, new things, I find the word define really confusing, both in the static property called define and StacheDefineElement and DefineObject. Wouldn't it be better to do something that's a little more descriptive, like, I don't know, CanObservableObject or CanObservable even, forget the object part. And maybe instead of define, we could do like, properties or something. Like, why define?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think the legacy of it is that it's using object define property under the hood. So that's kind of where the term comes from, and also the kind of getters and setters and value and things like that all kind of mimic those API, the native browser API. But yeah, I think that is a valid point. I don't know, Justin, do you want to say more about the word? I think we did talk about using other properties.
Yeah, we did talk about using. I mean, I think we could use observable. I mean, one thing in terms of the design consideration is to remember that there is an array form of this. So when you're naming, you want to make sure that you take that, when you're coming up with names, you want to take that into account. I do think observable object and observable array and then calling it props would be a fine suggestion. I can't think of, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't see a issue with that. Part of this is like also just from people who are coming from like CanMap world, CanJS 2.3, which uses define. It's going to be more familiar, but I would definitely support taking a look at alternative names like observe object, observe array, and props in there.
Yeah, or something else. I just find define really confusing, because I thought before it gets nailed down, like you said, and into a part where we can't erase very well, I wanted to bring up the fact that I think the name is confusing and doesn't offer a lot of help for people. So I feel like we should change that.
Well, I guess I would say that it depends on what you care about. and what you're trying to sell a little bit. So observability isn't what we're trying to sell as much with this. It's the well-defined, like the way that it's expressed, at least in the docs, like when Matthew and I were talking about, is these create well-defined observables. Obviously, observables are there as well, but the ability to formally, more formally describe property behaviors to get away from like imperative code is one of the strengths of this, and especially as the type system we'll see is much more robust in this. The ability to structure, we also talked about like structured objects is like a possible word as well, is a consideration in terms of like how it's being marketed. Are observables as valuable to people as being able to really structure your objects and articulate their behavior to the extent that this can do? I don't know. That's what I would see is like what the, another axis of deciding this.
Cool.
But please write up an issue. I mean, it's, these things can,
One other thing about the naming is that, well, first off, like we debated vigorously about what the name should be, and we didn't really. I don't think any of us loved the outcome, but naming's hard, and we've used a lot of names that we can't use anymore, and the more we design this same thing over and over, we run out of more names. But one thing to consider too is that we wanted to leave open the door to when decorators are available, and then there maybe be a different version that doesn't have a static defined property, but instead uses decorators, and we want to fit that in so that we don't take up a really good name that might be better used in the future.
Well, I think related to that is the consideration that we call it StacheDefineElement, and I guess it could be stash observable element. We can talk about the element name. Why we did? A lot of people might be wondering, why didn't we call it CanElement or CanElement or stash element? And that was because we want to leave. We're thinking, maybe we will for 6.0, but at least for 5.0, we're thinking that stash might have multiple different view and state management layers to it. You would have different types of elements. You could have you could have a React reducer or JSX reducer version or whatever. So we wanted to leave room for having different ways of creating elements. So that's why it's named, the element is named what it is. It's not just CanElement.
Yeah, the one idea is we want to experiment with different view layers, different state management solutions, and see if it's worth building those in, or what we want to do.
Can I talk about some of the differences of CanDefineObject versus CanDefine? Or are you planning on?
Yeah, we're gonna get there.
Okay.
Can we? Yeah. Is there any other thoughts about like the high level, like name? I mean, that was a great comment, Adam, on the name, the high level names.
Nothing else from me.
Right. Cool. So the next thing, we're going to go through some improvements over DefineMap and DefineList, exactly what you were just trying to bring up, Matthew. So the first is just that we're using normal JavaScript classes. We don't have to explain our extend method or anything like that. This extends is just a normal JavaScript extends, and we don't have to document how any of this works. This is how JavaScript works. So that is one big advantage. The next is expandable properties are observable by default. So with CanDefineMap, you would have to do like obj.set in order for this to be set up correctly. With DefineObject, you don't have to do that. You can just basically create a new object, and you can automatically. I think I know this.
Isn't there just an on function too?
I don't know. I'm the object, you mean? Probably. I don't know for sure. So you can just do this and it works, basically, is what's going on. So object name equals boo, and that should work. So these things are set up by default, and then if you look at obj, what's happening is it's actually creating the getter and setter for that name property automatically. It's hitting, there's a proxy someplace in here. Yeah, there's a proxy here at the very end of the prototype chain that looks for these expandable properties being set and sets up the getters and setters, just like if you had defined that property ahead of time. Cool. I think that's really awesome. Anybody want to talk about how awesome that is before I move on? No? Okay, cool. So the next thing is we really tried to clean up the API of DefineMap as much as possible. So in DefineMap, getters worked differently depending on how many arguments you had. So you could create a normal getter like this, and then you could create an asynchronous getter using this resolve argument, which is the second argument, although it's used a lot more often than the first argument. So you could do something like this. With DefineObject, we've separated these. So we have normal getters or just getters, and then we have a separate property or a separate property called async that you can use for these asynchronous getters. And you can do the same thing. You can use the resolve argument to resolve with your value, or if you return a promise from an async, then it will actually, the value of promise prop here will actually be set to whatever the value of the promise is. Just like if you had done this. That's kind of hard to explain, but yeah. Justin, you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say getters are still supported directly within the class body.
Yeah, so you can either do this here, or you could put it here as well. Just say get prop. And those are supported as well.
What about doing it in the define?
What?
What about doing it in the define as well? You could do a get prop in there, and we could set up the same thing. I know we haven't talked about that, but I was just realizing that's. I don't know if people would want to do that, but I could see an argument because I like to order my props, and it's weird if like I have some value ones above all the getters. I don't know. I feel like you should still be able to use that shorthand in the define. I don't know.
So,
okay.
Quick question: if you return a promise inside a getter and it rejects, what value does it set it to? Undefined or what?
It doesn't set the value.
Okay, so yeah, gotcha. So it'll remain undefined, or is I guess what I was trying to ask, but yeah, makes sense.
Actually, that's an interesting question. Does it never set the value, or does it set it up to undefined? You know, because those are getters. So, like in theory, if there was an observable property read, it would create a new promise. It would make a new request or something every time. I think it does set it back to undefined, but I'm not sure. That's a good question. I don't know if Christopher is here. He worked on that. I don't know. Actually, I would expect it if it rejects to set it to undefined. I don't know if anybody else feels like it should. I don't think it should leave the old value if it remade a new request.
Yeah, I think that would make sense. Cool. Good question, Austin. Thanks.
Yeah, let me take a note of that one.
I got it written down.
Oh, you got it? Cool.
Yeah. Cool. The next thing is we've tried to clean up type and default. We used to, in DefineMap, have lowercase type and uppercase type and lowercase default, uppercase default. Those don't exist anymore. There's just the lowercase, so it's just lowercase type. It's just default. We don't support the type, this kind of thing anymore. It's just, if you want to use a string, you have to use the string constructor. For defaults that are an object, you used to have to have a default function that returns an object in order for that object not to be shared by all instances. You can now do this get default. You can have a getter for default that returns an object, and then that'll be created for each instance.
Kevin, on that, so like object initializer, or whatever constructor initializers, whatever they call it, where there's
Public
this,
fields?
huh?
Public fields?
Is it public fields where you could just initialize directly in the class body?
Directly in the, just like
Yeah,
this?
or initialize the
But not
stats. But you
static.
can also do instance ones, right? And like, I don't,
Yeah.
is that supported in?
I think it's just in
Or
Chrome.
you could
I
just
think
do
it's the same
prop
thing.
equals an object.
Right.
Is that supported in some browsers?
It's
I think
only
it's-
supported in Chrome right now.
Yeah, I think it's the same
Only
thing.
Yeah.
Same thing as this.
Is there
yeah.
going to be like a difference or any conflict if people do stuff like that?
Currently, it doesn't. We don't handle that. We could handle it this just like it's a property in Define. We could do that.
Because we set things up differently. We set it up to be lazily evaluated, but that would like be. Would this code? Does anybody know? Would this code share that same object across all, or is that almost as if it was written in line? Like, is that creating one object shared by every cool person instance?
I think it probably is a. I would think it.
I would expect it to be.
I thought it acted as if you were creating it inside the constructor when you did that.
I don't know. But that's something to, I don't know. I don't know how, if this affects our design. One thing is I would expect default not to be used very much, and people just use inline defaults in the future, except maybe if they want types, then they bring it in for this definition. Yeah, it's got to be shared, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, makes sense. That's what I'd expect. Okay.
So do people think we should support that? Support properties that way? Should we?
Why wouldn't it be? Shouldn't this already be supported though?
It doesn't work currently because that stuff is set up before your constructor runs, I think, or something like that. So it doesn't like just work. We would have to.
I would expect it to cause a set inside.
It doesn't call the set, it calls
Doesn't call the
object
set.
defined property. Just so you know.
Oh,
You
We
can
don't
still catch that with a proxy if you
yeah.
guys.
We don't have one of those, and I think we don't want to have one because we depend on not having one or something. But anyways, we could make it
Okay.
work.
Yeah, we could probably figure out how to make that work if we need to.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's we probably should make that work. So Kevin, you're taking these kind of notes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking about that this morning. I was going to try to implement it, but then I had to figure out how to make the test only run in Chrome and stuff, and didn't do that.
Yeah. Cool. The last thing is that enumerable and serialize are two separate things now. So you can set an enumerable true or false, whether or not that property is enumerable, and then set a serialized function that actually handles like custom serialization if you want. So these things are no longer the same thing. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is we're using strict types by default. So in DefineMap, we would basically it would do a bunch of type coercion. That's kind of how types worked. Is if you use a type as a number, it would coerce any other values into a number when you set that property. Now we're actually doing strict types by default. So if you create this person and you set age to something that's not a number, it's going to throw find, or if it's a string, it's going to throw, but if it's a number, it's going to work. The can type package has a lot of, I think I might talk about this later, I'm not sure, has a lot of options that allow you to do other things if you want to. So for example, if you want to support a number or undefined or null, you can do like type.maybe and pass it a number that basically is a maybe type, so a number or undefined or null. If you want to convert other things, you can do maybe convert or just type convert depending on what you want. So there's a lot of other options available in the type package, but by default, everything is strict types. I feel like this is one that people are either going to love or be very angry about. Does anyone want to talk about this?
I like it myself. That's all I want to say.
Cool. Any other type stuff do you want to talk about, Matthew? I didn't cover a ton of the can type.
Well,
package.
just yeah, I'm almost on the side of I would prefer maybe to be the default, but I kind of see the argument for it, or I guess I would say the argument in favor of the strict types as a default is that, you know, this is mostly for building applications. You know, CanJS is for building apps. And in apps, you want to have like more strict, more strict errors and stuff. That way you catch stuff sooner. You don't want stuff to hit production. But the other thing I was going to say is that you probably would maybe want or possibly want to use the strict types like on components, but then use the convert ones on models, because your models are more likely you're getting data from services. That's all.
We've also thought about making it so that you can say maybe by default on the, what's it, the properties or the definitions. Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't talk about can type, did you?
Well, I mean, I just briefly talked about type.maybe. And
Oh,
we should definitely go through the methods and talk through them.
yeah.
do you have type.any is a
Yeah.
important one too.
It's can type in second, right? At least.
Yep.
Sort of.
Hope so. Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, cool. Do we want to go through all of these now, or come back to this?
I'd say we go through them. To me, for this audience, I think it makes sense to concentrate on like what the differences between can define. So like in can define, there was like an asterisk type, and that meant that we didn't do anything, like it just left it alone. And that's what type.any is there, the capital A any. Look on that one.
Yeah, so this will basically let you.
These are documented not using can define object. Maybe they should be, but they're doing it the lower level way. But yet, type.any just basically leaves the thing alone. So if you have some like, I don't know, you have some type of object that you're getting from like another library or another service or anything where you don't want it to be converted, you would use type.any.
Cool. So then, other than type.any, there's basically 4 methods on here. So type.check creates a type that will throw if it's set to something that's not the right type. Type.convert will do the old type coercion. So if you set it to a value that's not that type, it'll coerce it into that type. Type.maybe allows the type or undefined or null. And then type.maybe convert will convert if it's not the type or undefined or null. There's no maybe check. Is that a thing?
That's what maybe is.
Oh, that's what maybe is. Right. Okay. Yeah. Gotcha.
And again, naming here is
Yeah, I know.
it's hard.
And then the last thing is this is documenting what these other things return. They basically all of these other types return back a type object that has these 2 symbols that we use internally. So it's a symbol for creating a new value, and then a symbol for checking if the value is that type.
So the thing to think about for everybody here to bike shed is on the name convert and maybe, and then also like the maybe convert. So a convert, and you could also maybe check, but that's not gonna
I'd
be
bike
the
shed that check could be strict, you know.
Yeah. So let me just run through. Yeah. So we've also thought about check or strict for check, and for convert, coerce. And then for maybe, null or undefined. So you could write or null or undefined, and you would pass like date or something like that. Maybe is the best one that we've come up with. We haven't come up with like a really plausible alternative for maybe. And then maybe convert is basically like it would be you could also have that maybe coerce.
Or loose.
Or loose. Instead of maybe, right? Is that what it was? Or loose instead of convert?
Loosest of maybe convert. Because that's like the loosest one.
Oh, it'd be a combination. Yeah. So, any ideas there or thoughts there?
No. I like strict. I like strict over check, because you're not just checking, you're actually like saying this has to be this type and we will throw an error otherwise. But yeah.
So if you like strict, would you want to use loose then instead of maybe convert? Like the other end of the spectrum, like the opposite of strict is.
That's interesting. Like, just instead of maybe convert is just called loose. That's neat. It's maybe not as descriptive, but interesting.
What is more descriptive? Unstrict? No. I don't
Well,
know.
maybe convert I thought was interesting. If you've already defined maybe and you've already defined convert, then maybe convert is probably more descriptive. But then again, loose is cool too, because it does sort of give you that, this is the one end of the spectrum and this is the other.
Okay. The other thing we talked about was coerce. Can all of you just type the word coerce into the chat and don't send it until I say, and we'll see, because see if we can all spell it. I think that's I'm kidding. You don't have to actually do that. I think we should still support both convert and coerce, but
one interesting idea would be to, with the people, make note of people who came to this, and then everybody else who did not, we should just go up and be like, what do you think type.maybe, type.convert does? And then try it against some of the alternatives and just see if they would know.
okay. People could watch this on YouTube, right? So
Yeah, it's true. We have to
Okay.
ask them, and they have to
Honor
tell us
system.
honestly. Yeah,
Just go to people on the street.
yeah.
all right, cool. I'm gonna move on. I think there's more interesting stuff. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier we're not supporting like a string as a type, which means you can have this shorthand default value with strings and numbers and booleans if you want to. You can do false here, and that works, which is cool. You don't have to have an object with the default that is 5 or whatever. You can just do prop 5, which is nice. All right. The next thing I'm going to talk about some StacheDefineElement improvements over CanComponent. So the first thing is one we kind of already talked about at the beginning. We're actually creating real custom elements. So these basically can be used anywhere. So you can define your class and call custom elements define, and then you can basically use it however you want. You can call the constructor, and that will actually create an instance of the element. You can also use document create element, and that'll create an instance of the element. It's real custom elements. It's not fake custom elements like we had before. Any other benefits of this that you want to talk about, Justin? I don't know if I captured all of your.
I mean, it makes custom elements, like real ones, that there is no separation between your view model and view.
Oh, right. The other thing, yeah, the element is the view model. So setting properties on the element actually, works correctly. You don't have to do my element, whatever, that view model, that title.
I think future plans, we're not totally sure, but eventually I would suspect some way of handling the attribute property connections that people would want. So if you set an attribute, it can update a property accordingly. But we're punting on that for now.
Yeah. Cool. The next thing is the lifecycle. We try to improve the lifecycle over CanComponent. This is still up for fierce debate today, so we'll see. But this is kind of what it's going to look like. I mean, this is our current iteration of what we think this will look like. So you can create your element, and then we wanted to make it really easy for you to test different pieces. So basically, give you some methods that you can call so that we can ensure that everything is in the state you want in order for testing. So there's kind of two things that you might want to do. So this first one you can call this initialize method, and then basically you can test your view model. You can also pass props in here if you want to, and those would be used to set up all of your setters and getters and all that kind of stuff. You can also just call the render method. So this first one is basically like you want to test your view model. You can create the instance, initialize it, and then you can do all your testing against the view model type stuff, all of the define properties and getters and setters and that kind of stuff. The next thing is if you want to actually test the view, so you can call the render method, and that will actually test the view. And you can pass properties in here, and this will call initialize, and it'll pass these values to initialize, and then it'll render your stash view into the element. So that's kind of the two things that you might want to do for testing. I think testing your view model, testing your view, and then the next thing is we wanted to give you, yeah.
I have a question. Can you pass the props into the constructor?
Yeah, you can.
Instead of doing initialize?
We punted on that. It's a good question to ask the people here for some bike shedding. So
right, we cannot. Right now, if you pass props in like this, it'll actually throw in the constructor today, because we wanted to in the future leave it open to either do nothing or.
Well, let's ask. Don't tell. Don't.
Okay. All right. Cool.
What do people think that it should do? Like, okay, so there's these 3 different life cycles. There's initialize, render, and there's like connected, which I don't know if he'd fully describe, but that's when you're like traditionally connected to the DOM. That's where you do things where it's like, to me, that's where like you're really the most alive. Like the surrounding DOM should be what it should be. If you pass a new my element like that, what do you think? What like state of the element's life cycle should it result in?
Well, you keep saying element. Is the instance of the component supposed to represent the element?
It is an element. It is a node that you could just append to the page if you wanted.
Okay. So what happens if you do like new HTML element right now in like DOM?
You can't.
You can only do one that's extended.
And if you pass values into that, what happens, I guess?
Well, you can't.
You're saying if you
extend it.
If you extend it, yeah, it's just like a normal JavaScript object. You can pass props to it.
And then you do const.
Really?
Yeah, but it's not going to do anything.
It won't. If you added a foo bar property, is foo on my L? Yeah.
Well, let's see. Yeah, let's see.
Oh,
he did. You have to define it. Yeah. Something to forget.
Oh, you have to do that before you can call the constructor?
Yeah.
Oh, ugh. Why is that?
Reasons.
Damn.
Oh.
Long story short, my answer was you should do whatever that does.
Well, but we have maybe. But if that does nothing, we should bring it. There is no life cycle. It doesn't connect it. We have additional life cycles. Okay, so it doesn't add the property.
Doesn't do anything.
Which is weird to me.
What is?
I'm not talking. Okay, so that's one possibility. Is we literally we don't even initialize. We just totally ignore that as an argument. That's fine. Part of me to show my hand. As I felt like it should probably at least initialize like the view model, if you think of like the properties with those properties, and possibly call render so that you have like a render. That way, if you wanted to just create an element and then stick it to the body or something, you could just do new my element, pass it your initial props, and then the result of that could just be literally appended to the document and it'd be fully rendered. Now, it would still be fully rendered anyways because connected callback would run and then call the render. It's more about, actually, in some ways, it's more about testing what you'd want from testing when you call new my.
It's exclusively what you want from testing because, like in the real world, it's not going to happen, right? It's going to basically be created like this if you actually have this in your app.
Would it though? I feel like a lot of times might be like initializing an element with certain properties or things like that before I stick it into the DOM.
Okay, I don't think that's how most people create
right
HTML.
now. Oh no,
Yeah.
you create the element and set its properties and things like that if you're creating an element manually. You don't create it with initial batch of properties.
Yeah, what I'm saying is people don't do that. They just put HTML on the page.
They
Right.
do, and then they'll set the href on a link.
And I don't think people are creating links programmatically, is what I'm saying.
Oh, but if you are, I mean, I guess for this,
That's what I'm saying. You aren't usually, but I get your point.
Anyway,
So for right now, it throws. We've left it open. It throws and says, "Don't do this because we want to leave this open."
Well, to me, it's kind of there's two sides to it. It is an element, and on that hand, you might expect it to work the way an element works, but it's also a define object, and there's an expectation that it works like a define object. So it's like, which one wins out in that? Is this more an element or more a define object? And it's both. So I don't know.
the way I think about
I
it,
think practicality, I want to be able to pass props because that's how I would do testing.
and I guess I think of it as the base class doesn't take arguments. So, but it's not unnatural to then have an inheriting class take one argument during construction and do additional things on top of the base class. So it's not weird. I don't think it's that odd if like we took an argument where HTML element does not, or element does not.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever.
Yeah, if it does nothing, like if it doesn't expect certain things, I agree. It's not that bad to do something different.
Cool.
But
Next
I
thing is
guess,
that-
I guess just to recap then for people.
Oh yeah, I
initial-
didn't finish.
yeah, the life cycle stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So initialize sets up your view. It can take props. Render sets up your view. It can take props. And then the other thing is you can actually there are some lifecycle methods that you can implement in order to do certain things when your
And there's a
element-
connect too.
Right.
That's not shown here.
Yeah, but it doesn't do anything.
Well, it calls render and initialize. One thing is you didn't mention that when you call render, if it hasn't been initialized, it will initialize and then render.
Right.
And if you call connect, it will initialize render and then call your connected callback.
Right. So you have there's two hooks that you can implement yourself. So there's connected, and then there's disconnected that you can do. You can do things in. So these will get called basically at the very end of the connected call. That's another thing I didn't mention is by default in the page, these get called by the connected callback. So when your element is put in the page, the browser will call the connected callback if you have one. This is part of custom elements lifecycle hooks. There's a connected callback that gets called automatically by the browser. And that will call initialize and call render and then call connect. And then once those are done, it'll call connected if you have that implemented. So if you had this, then you could do sorry for all these terrible names. You could do my element 2.connect, and it would call initialize, call render, and then call your connected function. If this were doing something, if you need.
Presumably, you could even call connected callback, and it would do that too because we've changed connected callback.
Yeah, correct.
Which is a little weird, but this is how it is.
It's a little weird.
I have a question. Should disconnected, if someone implements disconnected, should stop listening still be called if they didn't call stop listening?
Can I answer?
You can answer, but it's nice to
Yes.
get feedback from the crowd. But so we call stop listening no matter what, even if they forgot to like write it. Yeah.
Yeah, we call stop listening. We call your disconnected hook, and we also call anything that you return from connect. If you want, you can return a teardown function from connected if you want to. in case you were doing some kind of set timeout or something in connected, you don't want to have to store that timeout ID somewhere. You can just clear it inside of connected.
I'm on board. I think that's fine.
Anything that prevents memory leaks should occur.
What's that?
I think anything that prevents memory leaks should be prioritized.
So a user would never have to call stop listening there themselves.
They would not. No, I just don't have a good example of what you would call.
What would you use disconnected for then? You would probably
weird YouTube kind of things, maybe. I don't know. Like, yeah.
But can you stick those kind of things into a listen to? Probably.
No, only if it conforms to like our symbols, or it has an add event listener, which it might, but.
But set timeout doesn't conform to that, and you can use listen.
No, you can't. You got to use. You can't call listen to on a set timeout. You have to call.
Well, I know you can't call listen to on a set timeout, but you can use listen to.
Well, no, you return a function.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Okay.
Just a lot of times, I think everything is just being connected, and there will be no disconnected.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe if you would use disconnected if you don't, like if you needed to log something. I don't know, like if you wanted to write to like make an API call to your logging server or something that said this was removed. I don't know exactly, but if you need to do something that doesn't need to be connected, it just needs to be disconnected.
Yeah.
All right, cool. The next thing is that we now support required properties, so you can in your define. I don't know why this probably should have been part of the DefineObject improvements. Anyway, you can set a property as required, and this will basically, if you create an instance of this element and don't pass it this property, it'll throw it. So you can do this on either a define object or your element, and basically your element, if you don't pass it in through an attribute or something like that, will throw.
So there's a good question for everybody here to let us know if we're doing things right. What's the difference between like required true and like, let's say you had a title and you just did type with string, or you did type with string and required true. What's the fundamental difference that required is? What's different between required versus just title name string or something? Where does required
You mean like, I would say you couldn't instantiate an instance of that without having that title property on it? Is that the answer you're looking for?
That is the answer I'm looking for. Good. Yeah, I mean, so type string, the interesting thing here, this was interesting to me. It's kind of subtle, but like you can initialize a my element with name as undefined or as undefined, which feels weird. So name could be undefined. It can be initialized with undefined, but can never be set to anything other than a string. So type really controls the setting, but if it's initialized without a default value, fine, we're going to still leave it null, but anytime a setter comes in, it's got to be a string, is essentially what this says. Required goes like an additional step further, or kind of like does a separate step in some ways, which is like upon initialization, we have to be passed a string. So if that makes sense to everybody, then good. just want to make sure that's clear.
That makes sense to me.
And then required post that point is never used again. So it's like you could have a maybe string allowing nulls undefineds and set title to null, and it would be like, yeah, that's totally fine.
And you just lost me.
So you can do type that maybe required true, right? Is what you're saying, and then
you have to instantiate it with a name, but you could set that name to undefined later.
You could instantiate with null. That would work as well.
But not undefined.
Undefined, if you passed undefined, would work.
Yeah.
But if you have to pass something.
That's weird.
So this would not work. This would work.
Yeah. Now we could create another maybe, which would be like null or, which would not allow undefined. The reason why we're supporting both null and undefined is because, well, CanJS has always kind of treated those things as more or less the same. But yeah, following the rules of the type stuff, like maybe means null or undefined works. Required only operates on initialization, so there is a value passed. It is the undefined value. So this would be fine. You could change that to a null or string. You know, we could create a type. Kevin, just like hypothetically write it in instead of type.maybe, type null or. That now would throw an error. And we could add a null or as well to complement maybe.
Personally, I think it's fine. I think it's good because the concepts of required and the maybe are separate, and that I think it's fine. It's weird. I can't think of a use case, but I think it's fine.
Cool. I think that's it. The only other thing I've got a couple of examples if people want to go through larger examples.
There's two other things that I guess I'd like to ask people about. The first is like if you just define a property, but then just set it : an empty object. What does this represent? What is its type? What should this do? If I set, let's set, then I set m.name to an array.
So you're asking us what we think this would be?
Yeah,
I think just from my experience, I would think this would default to sort of an any type and probably just be fine. But I'm not sure. If
yes, but should we make that array observable for you?
So then you could do like.
I don't think so.
Name.push. Never.
And well, you could already do that, but should that be observable if you did that?
Right.
What's there?
Well, I'll let someone else answer.
If you could make it observable without changing it, then yes. But I'm pretty sure that would now be a new instance and would no longer equal the old instance. So maybe not.
That's also doing coercing, whereas the default for everything else is to do checking. So that feels odd to me. It's like,
well, it's defaulting to an any type, right?
well, that's what it's doing now. But I'm saying that if it were coerced to an observable, that's not how types work. Like if you said name string, it's not going to coerce to a string. It's going to ensure it's a string.
So presently in CanMap and CanDefine, they are both hungry if left undefined, meaning they will take any object or array and convert it to an observable automatically. Right now, we decided not to do that, that this is an implicit. There is a type.any, and you might have noticed that briefly while Kevin was going through that. But this is an explicit. This is basically the same as writing type.any. It just leaves whatever value alone. Now, this gets into the other thing that I want to talk about is hungry types. Matthew, Kevin, have we talked about those at all since last time?
No.
So we just had like the crazy ideas we had last time. So this is still a relatively common need to want to be able to just like add some crazy nested array and object data structure and have it just like be converted recursively through observables. Some like meta object with, you don't know what's going to be there. You just know you want to make it observable, whatever's going to be there. Or meta could even be set to null. It's like you want to support if it's set to null or a string, but if not, if it's set to an object, do this crazy stuff. So we've just come up with like crazy type names to support this. these things would be like on define object itself and be like define object.hungry or define object dot like convert to observable or primitive, stuff like that.
I thought there was a couple others that were pretty good, like eager was one.
Yeah.
What was the other name?
I guess, if we haven't thought this through, let's leave this. Let's just warm everybody up with the idea, and then we'll probably put an open source at some point, like what the solutions are here, the ideas more formally for people to weigh in on, because it's one of like the last tricky API things. If you remove that from happening automatically, then to like allow people to add it back in is a little weird because of timing issues, where you really need both you need define object and define list to really both exist. Because they kind of need to work together to make this recursion happen. And you can't do it on type. You can't do type dot like, it can't exist there, because otherwise type would then depend on define object or define array. So the API choices are more limited.
As far as the empty object thing, that would mean I wouldn't want it to be different. So if you didn't define that property and you just used it, you create an expando name, what does that do? That forget what that does actually. That's any.
Same thing. Yeah.
Well, is it? No, but I thought doesn't it like if you pass it a string, doesn't that become
No.
It basically defines itself as a string, right?
No, it doesn't do that.
Oh, I don't think that's a good question. I don't think
it
we
was
can further types, do we?
I tried this out and it doesn't.
Well,
it's not the same thing.
Let's forget about what actually happens and talk about what should happen, because it might just be that I didn't implement that part. But I thought we talked about it, that we were like, okay, now this is going to be, in the future, this is strictly a string.
Oh, really?
I think that would be good. I think that would be good.
Okay, look, back up. If you pass it, if you have a default, then it does do that. And we did talk about that should happen.
Oh, that's a good thing. We didn't talk about that.
If you do age 15, that becomes a number type.
I forgot about that shorthand.
Strictly enforced.
Yeah, this is.
So is it? Yeah. So is it?
Let's show people what you're talking about before we go on, so they know what you mean.
Don't use the console. You're just writing a text editor.
No, you write it in the text editor. So you do age 5. So
yeah. I hope that works, because it's supposed to. To get tests.
Why was it undefined? That's a bug.
I guess. It must be. It's pretty surprising to me.
Oops. Did I do something
Double
wrong?
bug? No, you did it right. I'm pretty sure that's a syntax. I think there's just a bug.
Okay. I'll fix that right after this.
But anyway, like, what should both of these do? I think this should throw.
Yeah, I think so too, because I think it should work the same way as defining a default.
It's not a default though, and it's not like you could still have the default is like a short. Okay, I guess I'll dissent, and my dissent is default is a shorthand. If you really wanted to have a default, you could possibly have a default with like a different type or like a convert type, and so you could just write the number 5, but then have a convert type convert that for you to like the string, and that would be fine. So you can have, it's possible, but it'd be weird to have a type and a default that don't match. Objects by themselves, with nothing else in JavaScript, it is pretty standard to have them be able to swap types. You can set a property to a number, then you can set it to a string. I lean more towards running like an object when you have like a basic property, but that's.
I think if we're going to have strict types by default, we should also have strict type inference. Should infer what the type is and treat it the same way.
Are there situations where that would be like, because you can never get out of that, right? If you have like an unknown, How?
You could do property defaults type.any. That should fix it if you wanted to do
So
that.
what type would this be? We should have like a type.infer then to like once the setter goes through, once the value comes in, then you're locked in. We should probably have that. I mean, I'm not super strong against this, mildly.
I mean,
but
we can fun on it.
I'd be pacified if I was like, I'd be pacified if someone was like, oh, well, here's that name of that type behavior essentially, which is.
Well, the thing is, we need the name for the other.
Type.any.
If you wanted it to not.
It's type.any. That's the default.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
So I would just say come up with a good name, and then I'm more on board with it.
Well, I think we should probably try to be use case driven too. If we don't have a use case, then maybe we should just not define anything.
No, we're going to have to, because it would be a breaking change to go to strict, whatever we're calling this, inferred typing.
Not the way we do. The way we do it is documentation.
Oh,
is what makes something breaking.
But that's fine. We can have
Not
a breaking
broken
change.
if you don't document it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the way CanJS works.
Yeah, it is. It is.
We can have a breaking change.
Oh, we
for
can.
now, right?
Yeah, we have
some
a few
time.
months before we have a breaking change. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. The only other thing I had some bigger examples. If people are interested in seeing these, let me know and I can post them someplace. We've got a to-do MVC example, and then I have an example of using it with React, which is kind of interesting. So if you're interested in that, we're over time already. I mean, I can show them now if people want, but half the people have dropped already. So taking that as a hint, as maybe we should be done.
Show it real quick. Just skim through the code.
All right, to-do MVC. To-do MVC. There's not really a ton of interesting bits. It's very similar to the existing CanJS to-do MVC.
Why? That to-do.list. I know why you did it that way.
I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, we could just make it.
Well, you have to pass the list in with.
I did it this way because I just you could just do this and then pass it.
You have to pass it into the.
Here, which that's fine. You can do that, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is probably the way I should have done it, but I just copied and updated the old one, and that's how they do it. So yeah, interesting things. One thing we didn't show with arrays, this is basically the same as the old pound thing that you have in define list. So you can create this items property and tell it all enumerable properties in this array should be of type to do. So that's what.
Why did you use the getter instead of just items equals to do?
Just because that was the way that I saw it in the docs, and I wasn't sure if the other way was supported, and I didn't have time to try it. So it should be the same, right? You could just do this.
Yeah.
Yep.
In terms of the docs, we should probably only be showing that vast majority of places, and then maybe one little section say hey, by the way, if you're using older browsers, you can do this.
Yeah.
Cool. Define, or I guess it wasn't even documented. I mean, because I wrote this before the documentation just got published today or whatever. So I probably just looked at a test or something to see how it worked. And all our tests are using the getter format, right? Because we test in all of the browsers. Anything else that's interesting? There's not really much, I don't think. I think it's pretty straightforward, I think. The other one. So using it with React, I created this example because we were talking about how to do a React define element, and so I wanted to see how painful it is to use custom elements with React. So this is creating our CanJS person form custom element and then using it inside of this React app. So in order to set objects on custom elements, you have to do this ref and then use effect to set the actual properties. So you could set any of these properties to an object if you wanted to. I think this is the only way to do this, which is like not awesome, but not horrible, I think. So that's really the only interesting thing about this. Otherwise, this app doesn't do a whole lot. It's pretty small, but it allows you to pass some functions through from the React app to the. That's another thing I don't think I showed, this type function.
Is there a like hypothetically, could we conform? Like, could a mixin make these like the actual? I don't know if we have maybe get Christopher or someone here, but could we make our elements conform to what React elements APIs are, and basically supply their same hooks, so that?
So you're saying you could just do like.
Well, you really want to be able to pass stuff directly, person form like that, and not a ref, but just like actually set properties and then hook into everything so that it could just appear like normal.
Well, the React element thing could export a React base class too, and you could use that maybe or something.
Yeah, you just somehow wrap. Yeah, you would wrap your component somehow in a React component.
Yeah.
So that this all wires up. But the nice thing is you might be able to build like the property stuff automatic from the schema. I don't know.
What? What do you mean the property stuff from the schema?
I don't know if there's like special stuff with React where like it's not useful to know which properties you actually want to be managed. But we just know we have the information because our elements are introspective. You can introspective. What am I? Inspectable, reflective. You can find out information about that.
Yeah. I don't know the answer, but that's we obviously want to investigate that. I think.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin.
Thanks everybody who came and talked and is still here. Still have 5 people here. It's amazing.
And there's more people watching. Thank you, Christopher, for watching. He texted me, so I know he's out there.
Cool.
Cool.
Did he have an answer to that question? Can we?
He said he doesn't know what it would take to do that, but it's certainly possible.
Okay.
So, cool.
Cool.
All right. Thanks
everybody.
everybody. Have a good one.